It's the thing we're all talking about as we limp to the end of the year. What are we doing for our holidays and what's the weather going to be like? Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and today on The Detail, Sharon Brett Kelly and I will look at what we can expect this summer.
And Amanda, there's also a lot of talk about how tourism numbers have bounced back to pre-COVID levels. And of course, we have seen some really wild weather recently and events like the fires in Tongariro. So what does that really mean for the industry? Well, later in the podcast, I chat to Professor Stephen Espiner, who's done a lot of work for DOC and regional councils.
But first, Sharon, look, I'm going to talk to Earth Sciences New Zealand Principal Scientist and Meteorologist Chris Brandolino. Now, he says the wild summer ahead, we're going to have both sunshine and storms. It all comes down to Mother Nature.
As I like to say, Amanda, these 3-month outlooks, what we're trying to do is predict Mother Nature's personality. What is Mother Nature's personality going to be? A weather forecast, that's Mother Nature's mood. And most times, if you get the personality right, the mood will be aligned with that. There can be some days where it doesn't.
I hope she's warm and calm. That's her personality for this summer, Chris.
Yeah, me too.
Now, what then, Chris? What's the overall summer forecast for New Zealand this year? What can we expect? Is it going to be hotter, wetter, or sort of more unsettled conditions?
Yeah. So look, outlooks, just as a gentle reminder, these are themes. This is not a weather forecast. This is not what you would see on TV or here on Radio New Zealand, or even when you go to your favorite app or website. This is themes, what the themes are going to be for the next 3 months. So a big period of time. And the theme is going to be warmer than average with pretty high confidence for the upper North Island. So people either listening to this or maybe doing some holidaying in the Bay of Plenty, the Coromandel, the Waikato, Auckland, and Northland. This is where we feel confidence is the highest for above average temperatures, about a 2 in 3 chance for above average temperatures. Now, look, again, this is a theme. Just like I can tell you your theme for your marriage is going to be a good theme. It doesn't mean you won't have a bad weekend. It doesn't mean every single week or every single weekend is going to be a warmer than usual. It just means when it all comes out in the wash and we look back and it's early March, we say, oh, what kind of summer was it? We think that'll be above average. And we've already seen that, Amanda. I mean, we've seen temperatures quite warm in the Auckland area so far early this summer. And we'll see some ebbs and flows. It'll be a cooler week next week, but those cool periods are certainly going to be few and far between. That's our thinking. Now, for the rest of the country, we do think above average temperatures are going to be most likely for, say, Taranaki and Wellington and the Manawatu and King Country. Also the top of the South Island, like Nelson and over toward Marlborough, Tasman and that area. Maybe not the odds quite so high, but we still think that's more likely than not. And for the rest of the country, so we're talking Tairāwhiti, Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, over toward Canterbury, Otago, Southland, west coast of the country of the South Island, the confidence gets a bit lower on that unusual warmth. So we're going with somewhere in the average to above average category. So somewhere in that spectrum, some locations may land closer to average, i.e. not as warm, and other places may end up warmer than average. So more uncertainty, but I do think for those who are going to do some holidaying across or vacationing down in the national parks, across the South Island especially, I think there is a pretty good chance some cool spells will be greeting you, particularly in the middle part and maybe the second half of December. It's been quite warm, but there are some indications things will cool off for a period of time. A couple cool spells coming up. And it's that South Island that's going to be most exposed to those puffs or spells of cooler air on occasion. So that's why that confidence for above average or unusual warmth is not so great.
When we say unusual warm above average, I think we've had 33 degrees this week alone. How hot are we thinking?
As we approach Christmas, there are some pretty good signs that the North Island could see another puff of hot air coming from Aussie, and that could be another setup for that spikiness, 33, 34, 32 kind of thing. So I wouldn't be surprised Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, Boxing Day, around there, we see that materialize. We'll see. It's still several days away.
Now, on the flip side, the last thing tourists and international guests wants is heavy rain, flooding, any sort of cyclones or weather-related travel disruption. Any regions going to get that over the next few weeks, you think?
Yeah, look, I think in the interim, I'm talking about, let's say, next week. So from the 14th, the 15th, the 16th, There are indications that the west of the South Island could be in for a period of wet weather, heavy rainfall. For people who live in that part of the country, the western South Island, they just call that Tuesday. But for visitors, that could be quite profound because that is a temperate rainforest, that part of the country. They get a lot of rain. And while that is sort of what we call climatology, or it's normal, but for people who are coming from overseas, even Australia, which we affectionately call the West Island, they may be a bit caught off guard. So I think as long as we have that airflow where we have west to northwest winds, we do run the risk for these bouts or these periods of heavy rainfall events for the western South Island. This is when they get a lot of rain, typically, the western South Island. So Fiordland all the way up to Haast, right along the west of the South, kind of along and west of the Southern Alps. They can get a bucket load of rain this time of the year. I guess my other thing I would say is just be mindful of ex-tropical cyclones. We are in tropical cyclone season, and the risk we're giving New Zealand is considered normal to elevated. So typically it's the second half of summer, Feb, March, which is, I guess, autumn. Then is when we tend to have the greatest odds for something coming down from the north and giving us a bit of trouble. Could happen anytime, December or January. But I guess that'll be my public service announcement.
And obviously people come here because they love to do our hikes. And we're talking Tongariro Crossing. Obviously there's been issues there. Roy's Peak, Rootburn. I think there's Abel Tasman. That's a favourite. What should tourists know, Chris, about the sort of rapidly changing weather conditions there?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, Amanda. Rapidly changing conditions. Look, the mountains are notoriously difficult to forecast for. They can create their own sort of environment sometimes, it seems like. But yeah, having that awareness that, look, you can hop in your caravan, hop in your car, and be like, yep, we're going to go to the Tongariro Alpine Crossing today. And it could be a hot day in Auckland or a hot day in Hamilton, or expected to be a hot day. But you get to the mountain, you start gaining altitude, and it all changes quickly. Temperatures drop fast, the wind picks up, and hypothermia becomes a real thing. The effect of temperature is one thing, but if you're not properly attired, you don't have the right clothing, and you have the wind, and even if you have a bit of light rain, it's just kind of misty, but you have wind, you have temperatures, maybe it's 9 degrees or 12 degrees, but there's a 40 or 50K wind and there's a bit of rain falling, hypothermia is a real thing. So people often associate hypothermia with winter or, a cold season type hazard. But in reality, when you do hit the higher altitudes and hit the national parks and the mountains, hypothermia can happen year round. UV index too, as you gain altitude, the UV index increases. So that's something I think people should be aware of. And look, just doing a shameless plug, just check the weather forecast. We provide weather forecasts for the national parks to the Department of Conservation, and those are updated multiple times per day. So it's just really kind of doing your due diligence as a park goer, as a tramper, as a hiker, to understand, what do I need to do? What should I prepare for in terms of conditions?
Amanda, speaking of Tongariro, as we know, firefighters have contained the second big fire there this month. But the thing is, how do you get the message out to people, and I'm talking international and local visitors, about potential hazards?
Yeah, that's a good point. And what I'd also like to know is, how damaging is this for New Zealand's reputation? I mean, will these kind of stories put people off?
Well, that brings up the issue of just how dependent we are on tourism dollars. And we're talking to an expert in this area, Stephen Espiner, who's from Lincoln University. He tells me we're way back at pre-COVID levels in terms of tourism numbers and looking to lure another 1 million international tourists by 2030.
It's clear that wildfires are becoming more common in New Zealand. And yes, there's 2 fires in Tongariro, but there have also been other fires which have affected conservation in recent years, not least of which was a big fire actually out at Craigieburn Forest Park, Castle Hill, Flock Hill area in Canterbury down here near Arthur's Pass National Park, and of course the Port Hills fires back in 2017, which had massive effect on outdoor recreation infrastructure, and it restricted visitation and recreation for many, many months in 2017. One of the things we can say about certainly around our South Island national parks, are located in mountainous areas often with high rainfall, where fires may not be quite as likely. However, There are, of course, many very popular and ecologically significant conservation areas that are very vulnerable to fire, and a lot of those exist, of course, on the South Island's east coast and in Marlborough. In terms of whether we're prepared, I think there is some very good work being done. If you look at, for instance, the Department of Conservation's Climate Change Adaptation Plan, which attempts to position the Department of Conservation to, I guess, confront some of the challenges of climate change, one of which is wildfire. So I think there are instances or examples of where organisations like DOC are getting right across this. But of course, it's more than just fires. It's around rainfall, floods, coastal inundation.
With the extreme weather that we are experiencing and the ramifications of it, like the fires at Tongariro, do you think that DOC will have to look at, much tighter restrictions to, I suppose, manage it and manage tourists in the future? Would DOC look at closing national parks? I mean, that must happen anyway, I suppose, if there's a hazard.
Well, it's a great question. I mean, closing entire national parks is a tricky business, I suspect. The National Parks Act embraces the notion of the freedom of access sort of principle, which does make it a little bit challenging, but it is possible for DOC to restrict access to certain places because of health and safety reasons, but that usually relates to a specific facility, such as a track or a bridge or a hut. So you can see that they do this already on places like the Milford Track and the Kepler Track. Even just a few weeks ago were closed because of avalanche risk. At least the park itself isn't closed. It's not so possible to do that, but the facility, the track. But at other times, bridges, entire tracks, huts are washed away or rendered impassable, and I think DOC has much greater capacity to close those. But as I said before, when you're dealing with the wider backcountry, it's a much greater challenge. In many cases, the effectiveness of any restriction is very much dependent on, if you like, the willingness of visitors to comply with whatever messages might be given out by DOC. I mean, Cathedral Cove is a good example of this, a very, very popular DOC-managed site in the Coromandel. The track was, I think, closed for nearly 2 years after storm damage, and the public compliance around that signage was pretty, well, certainly wasn't, was a long way from perfect.
Oh, really? Pretty loose.
Yeah, people kind of went anyway. I think people, especially perhaps locals and New Zealand domestic visitors, they kind of make their own assessment and they'll have a crack anyway. But it was certainly frowned upon by the authorities and caused quite some stress, I think, for those managing the place.
So it is a tricky thing to manage then, isn't it? I mean, we might be facing a summer where there could be more threats like this, if you take Tongariro as the example.
Absolutely. If you go back maybe 20 years, I don't think wildfire, for instance, was particularly on the average recreationist's radar. The last 10 years, we've probably had 6 or 8, 10 fires probably of significance in, key conservation outdoor recreation spaces. We are going to have to get better at understanding those risks, listening to the messaging. But of course, messaging and effective messaging operates at multiple levels. I mean, if you're relying on the sign at the site, it's kind of the last reminder, isn't it? It's your last chance to convince. Effective messaging occurs at many layers or scales, which kind of probably begins with education in schools, maybe outdoor education, classrooms, clubs and societies, and then, of course, the wider general public media campaigns. And there are groups doing great work, people like the Mountain Safety Council. They've really invested heavily in media that connects with the people using the mountains, and that's both locals and tourists. And it's a long-term project, though. It's not a once and done situation.
Not something that you can roll out when there is an event.
Well, if you could, I guess, change the narrative around fires, for instance, and create some sort of a branding, catchphrase that increase people's scrutiny or their attendance to messaging at that given time, that can work. Another thought I had is in relation to sort of push messaging. You can imagine that with each of us carrying a mobile device these days, there is opportunity to warn people of particular hazards, as we well know through things like tsunami alerts and earthquakes. You could do similar things, presumably, with wildfires or with weather events, especially if you got people to sign up. If you were going to go and do the Heaphy track, and if one thing you decided to do was to sign up to some sort of push notification service, it could be very useful for you to be warned of a heavy rainfall event or a track closure, or it's about educating people to adopt those sorts of tools as and when they become available.
Amanda, remember 2020 when all our borders were closed and we had the national parks and beaches to ourselves?
Who could forget, Sharon? And there was also a lot of talk then about a tourism reset. What I'd like to know, though, has anything actually changed?
Well, not a lot, according to Stephen.
The short answer is nothing, although a lot was done at the time you've just alluded to. There was a lot of good work done by some of the tourism task force group that was set up by the previous government. I mean, to be fair, there have been some of those things have carried through, but by and large, it's been a question of good. The gates are open, let's get on with it. I see very little that's actually changed. There were a number of very good destination management plans written by the regional tourism organisations across the country. Many of them talked about things like regenerative tourism. But I think it's going to be hard for those organisations to actually enact those plans. I don't believe they've got government funding to secure some of their ideas, so they risk gaining dust on the shelf, unfortunately. As you said before, the tourism numbers to New Zealand have bounced back pretty much, give or take 100% of 2019 visitor arrivals, which is around 3.6 or so million people. That's a 6% growth since the same time last year, and we're back at being the second highest export earner behind the dairy industry.
Wow.
So people are coming again. They're getting into the national parks. They're visiting places like Tekapo and Taonau and Milford Sound in numbers. Some of those have well exceeded pre-pandemic numbers already. And so the longer answer includes the reflection that many of the very same impacts that were beginning to be problematic in 2019 are with us today.
But so what about this talk of regenerative tourism?
Well, regenerative tourism, I believe, at least conceptually, has quite a lot of promise. The idea is at the basis that tourists or visitors to a particular location are giving back more to a place than they take from it. So, I mean, intuitively, it has a great deal of appeal. In terms of what it might look like on the ground, though, regenerative tourism would consider things like donating specific ring-fence money to a particular environmental cause, planting a tree as part of your experience, maybe in a national park or a conservation space, contributing to citizen science in some way. Just taking a little bit of time out of your trip to do something that is about giving back to that community. But I do think that there is potential in exploring this possibility, seeing if we can operationalize the concept, because I see no other way really of helping tourism overcome some of the inevitable negative environmental, social consequences.
Really?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you can't fly 5 million people halfway across the planet and then inject them into otherwise small and sometimes sleepy communities and expect things to go really smoothly. I think there are always going to be hiccups and challenges that we have to confront. So if one way that we can do that is to try and, as I say, harness that human resource that tourists represent, we may keep everybody happy. If we can keep the tourist experience, a high quality one, then we also avoid the problem that some places around the world have confronted around over-tourism, where you see locals in the streets with signs saying tourists go home. Wouldn't that be awful to see that here in New Zealand? We just can't get to that point. The projections at the moment, tourism growing in New Zealand, if it kept growing at 6% a year, we will reach, or we'll get close to, the current government's aspiration of doubling the value of tourism at least, and that could mean 5 million tourists by 2030 something.
So at the moment we've got nearly 4 million, so it's another more than a million more in
It's a 25% increase. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think those, as you know, and you saw the new mayor on the news recently just saying that Tekapo's under strain. They're wondering, they're not even at peak season yet, and in late November they were bursting at the seams. So we live in this amazing place and we have incredible things to show people, but it needs to be understood that this is a dynamic region of the world with huge infrastructural challenges, some
Yeah.
of which we just can't easily overcome.
So, Amanda, what's in store for the non-hiking, hazard-chasing tourists?
If you're meaning me, you mean those craving a classic Kiwi summer of bright blue skies and those postcard perfect beaches. Will they be satisfied? Let's go back to Chris.
Yeah, look, I'll answer this question. I'll start in this way. The oceans are unusually warm. At the moment, in early and almost mid-December now, ocean temperatures over, I guess, coastlines across the North Island and farther afield are highly unusually warm. We call that a marine heat wave. And there's some technical definitions, but basically it just simply describes how unusually warm ocean temperatures are for a given time of year. And, we're in the lower 20s, which is just crazy
Oof.
for before even mid-December, the middle part of the month. So someone who wants to go to the beach and do a bit of body surfing or do some surfing or boogie boarding, whatever the case, or just kind of frolic in the sea, that's really, really inviting. Sounds awesome. But what that does also is it has an upward influence on our air temperature. Warmer than usual ocean temperatures give off more water vapor, so they provide more water vapor in the atmosphere. Water vapor is fuel for rain. So if there's more water vapor in the atmosphere, that does provide a setup for more heavy rain. You need something to sort of harness that vapor and turn it into rain, and that's where something like low pressure comes in. So your question is, should we expect settled weather? I think we're going to approach, for the next couple of days, yes, it should be fine. Dry, in fact, particularly for the upper North Island. So if you're looking for the best chances, the best opportunity, the best odds for your quintessential Kiwi beach day where there's sunshine and it's just absolutely flawless and the water is inviting, it's going to be the upper North Island. And so that's where your best odds are going to be on any given day to find weather suitable for the beach. I do think as we approach that Christmas period, after maybe a spell of unsettled weather, somewhat cooler weather, and the threat for rain, Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, Boxing Day, that should begin a period where potentially we see some more inviting conditions for the beach, warmer temperatures, settled conditions, things like that.
Holiday parks and campgrounds. Give us your best one for the weather for the summer and the one most likely to be prone to wet weather.
I think any campground or holiday in the upper North Island, the odds are in your favor, to use a line from Hunger Games. But if your holiday campground takes you to, say, Fiordland, or if it takes you to the South Island, I do think there certainly will be some good days, no doubt about it. But I do think you'll be in greater competition or competing with days that aren't so favorable, such as cooler temperatures and maybe some rainfall. So, yeah, I think a campground or a holiday spot in the upper half of the North Island probably puts you in the best position for the greatest odds for success.
We love success. What then is the single biggest mistake tourists make, do you think, Chris, when planning for a New Zealand summer holiday in for our weather?
I think it's not planning. I think, what people do, and I find this amazing. And look, I know I'm too close to it. It's my job, so I totally get that. But I just find it really amazing the number of people that kind of look out the window when they get up and they think, oh, it's sunny now, so that'll be the case in 6 hours from now or 3 hours from now or whatever. Weather is dynamic. It changes. It's not static. So this is where you have to actually take 5 minutes, 10 minutes. It's not that long. And just look at a forecast. Preferably you go to Met Service or you go to the National Parks page I talked about and get it from a reliable source. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes people make is they don't put enough emphasis and enough importance and value on doing a bit of prep work and informing themselves of the weather conditions before they begin their journey. There's this right of like, oh, she'll be right. There's this belief or this saying like, you know what, she may not be right. So you need to do your bit and put yourself in the best position, using that word again, for success. And that means not getting caught out in a gale or not getting caught out in flooding rainfall. And people coming from overseas, they probably don't have a full appreciation of our weather and climate, particularly the strength of the sun, how stinking strong the sun is in December and January, and how quickly you can get a sunburn. So I think that's something people may not fully appreciate, people coming from overseas, and just how quickly the weather can change once you gain altitude and put yourself in a mountainous environment, how darn quickly that can change.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Stephen Espiner and Chris Brandolino. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Ben Pearce. I'm Amanda Gillies.
And I'm Sharon Brett Kelly. Mā te wā.